A militant atheist college student at a prestigious university kicked a Virgin Mary statue outside the campus chapel during a drunken anti-religion rant. Exactly 24 hours later, he was found sobbing uncontrollably in the same chapel, begging for forgiveness from a God he claimed didn't exist. The autumn air at Princeton University carried the scent of burning leaves and academic ambition as 21-year-old Marcus Thompson stumbled across the manicured campus quad at 2:17 a.m. on a crisp October night in 2023. His philosophy major had equipped him with enough intellectual ammunition to demolish any religious argument, and 3 shots of Jack Daniels had given him the liquid courage to take his anti-theist crusade from the classroom to the streets. Marcus was everything his conservative Christian parents in suburban Atlanta had feared he'd become when he left for the Ivy League. What started as healthy intellectual questioning in his freshman year had evolved into militant atheism by junior year. He wore his disbelief like armor, wielding philosophers like Nietzsche, Dawkins, and Hitchens as weapons against what he saw as humanity's most persistent delusion. Religion is the opiate of the masses, he'd proclaimed just hours earlier during an impromptu debate at the Ivy Club, Princeton's most exclusive eating club. It's intellectual slavery disguised as salvation. The debate had started innocuously enough during the club's Friday night social. Marcus had been holding court near the bar, explaining to a group of admiring underclassmen why belief in God was not just irrational, but actively harmful to human progress. "Look at the evidence," he'd said, gesturing dramatically with his whiskey glass. "Every major conflict in human history has had religion at its core. The Crusades, the Inquisition, 9/11, all committed by people who thought they were doing God's work." Sarah Chen, a soft-spoken senior from the Religious Studies department, had quietly challenged him. "But what about all the good religion has done? Hospitals, universities, humanitarian aid, much of it started by religious organizations." Marcus had scoffed. "Correlation isn't causation, Sarah. Good people do good things despite their religion, not because of it. If anything, religion holds back human potential by making people waste time praying to imaginary sky fathers instead of solving real problems." The argument had escalated when James Mitchell, a Catholic sophomore, mentioned that his faith gave him comfort during his mother's battle with cancer. "That's exactly the problem," Marcus had said, his voice rising. "You're using fairy tales as emotional crutches instead of facing reality. Your mother either gets better or she doesn't. Praying to some cosmic wish-granter won't change the outcome." The room had gone uncomfortably quiet. Several students looked shocked at Marcus's callousness, but he was too drunk and too convinced of his intellectual superiority to notice. The Virgin Mary, Jesus, Allah, Buddha, they're all just psychological security blankets for people too weak to accept that we're alone in a random, meaningless universe, he'd continued. "At least have the courage to admit it." That's when James had stood up, his face flushed with anger and hurt. "You know what, Marcus? You're not just wrong, you're cruel. And someday, when life knocks that arrogance out of you, maybe you'll understand what the rest of us already know." Marcus had laughed, the harsh sound echoing through the suddenly tense room. "I'll make you a deal, James. If your God is real, let him prove it. I'll give him 24 hours to show me something, anything, that proves he exists. But when nothing happens, I want you to admit that your faith is just wishful thinking." The confrontation had ended with James storming out and the party atmosphere thoroughly killed. Most students had dispersed, leaving Marcus alone with his whiskey and his convictions. Now, stumbling across campus in the early morning hours, Marcus felt vindicated. He was intellectually honest in a world of comforting delusions. He had the courage to face reality without the crutch of supernatural belief. As he made his way toward his dormitory in Blair Hall, Marcus's path took him past the Princeton University Chapel, a magnificent Gothic revival structure that had stood on campus since 1928. Even in his intoxicated state, he couldn't help but admire the architectural craftsmanship, though he despised what it represented. The chapel was one of the few things about Princeton that genuinely annoyed Marcus. How could an institution dedicated to rational inquiry and scientific advancement house such a monument to medieval superstition? It seemed like a betrayal of everything the university claimed to stand for. Outside the chapel's main entrance stood a small garden area with several religious statues, including a particularly beautiful marble sculpture of the Virgin Mary. The statue depicted her in traditional blue and white robes, her hands clasped in prayer, her face bearing an expression of profound compassion and serenity. Marcus stopped in front of the statue, swaying slightly as the alcohol and his philosophical outrage combined into something approaching fury. "There you are," he said to the carved figure, his words slurring slightly. "The ultimate symbol of humanity's intellectual surrender." He pulled out his phone and began recording a video, which he planned to post on his social media accounts as part of his ongoing campaign against religious influence on campus. "This is Marcus Thompson, coming to you live from Princeton University," he said, turning the camera to show both himself and the statue. "It's 2 a.m., and I'm standing in front of a monument to one of history's most successful marketing campaigns, the Virgin Mary." He gestured toward the statue with theatrical contempt. "This piece of carved rock represents everything wrong with human thinking. Instead of celebrating human achievement, human reason, human potential, we worship a fictional teenage mother who supposedly gave birth to an imaginary savior." Marcus moved closer to the statue, his voice growing louder and more belligerent. "People pray to this thing, asking for miracles, begging for intervention from a non-existent deity. They waste billions of dollars, countless hours, and infinite emotional energy on elaborate delusions." He was working himself into a philosophical frenzy, fueled by alcohol and intellectual pride. "Well, I've got news for anyone watching this video. There's no God, there's no Virgin Mary, and there's no cosmic plan. We're just highly evolved primates on a rock spinning through space. And the sooner we accept that reality, the sooner we can start making real progress as a species." Marcus looked directly into his phone camera. "Earlier tonight, I made a challenge. I gave God 24 hours to prove he exists. Well, here's my counter-challenge to anyone who believes in this nonsense." Without warning, Marcus drew back his right foot and kicked the base of the Virgin Mary statue as hard as he could. The impact sent a shock of pain through his foot. The statue was solid marble and significantly heavier than he'd anticipated. But the gesture was made, recorded, and immediately uploaded to his TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter accounts with the caption, "Kicking superstition where it belongs. #Atheist pride #reason over faith #Princeton thinking. There's your miracle," he said to the camera, breathing heavily from both exertion and adrenaline. "I just physically assaulted your holy mother, and guess what? Lightning didn't strike me down. No angels appeared. No divine retribution. Because it's just a rock, carved by human hands to represent human fantasies." Marcus turned off his recording and pocketed his phone, feeling simultaneously triumphant and slightly nauseated, though he attributed the latter to the whiskey rather than any moral qualms about his actions. As he walked away from the chapel, Marcus felt the intoxicating rush of having taken a public stand for rational thinking. Tomorrow, his video would probably go viral among the atheist community. He'd be celebrated as someone brave enough to literally kick religious mythology where it belonged. But even as he savored his anticipated fame, Marcus felt an odd nagging sensation in the back of his mind. Not guilt, exactly, but something like unease. He dismissed it as residual social conditioning from his religious upbringing. Growing up Southern Baptist left psychological scars that took time to heal completely. Back in his dorm room, Marcus collapsed onto his bed without bothering to change clothes. His foot throbbed where he'd kicked the statue, but he wore the pain like a badge of honor. Physical discomfort was a small price to pay for striking a blow against humanity's oldest and most persistent delusion. As sleep finally took him around 4 a.m., Marcus's last conscious thought was satisfaction at having put his philosophy into action. Too many atheists, he believed, were content to argue in classrooms and debate online. It took real courage to make a public statement, to risk social backlash for the sake of intellectual honesty. What Marcus didn't know was that his video had indeed begun going viral, but not in the way he'd expected. While some militant atheist accounts were sharing it approvingly, the vast majority of responses were negative. Even non-religious students found his actions unnecessarily cruel and disrespectful. More importantly, what Marcus didn't know was that Sister Catherine Mary, an elderly nun who helped maintain the campus chapel, had arrived for early morning prayers at 5:30 a.m. and discovered the damage to the statue's base. She'd knelt in the garden, not to curse Marcus or demand divine punishment, but to pray for whoever had done this, to pray that their obvious pain and anger might somehow be transformed into peace. "Blessed Mother," she'd whispered, "whoever did this is hurting deeply. Please help them find what they're really looking for." Marcus slept until nearly 2 p.m., waking with a pounding headache and a mouth that tasted like he'd been gargling with sawdust. His first conscious act was to check his phone for reactions to his video. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of views, hundreds of comments, and dozens of shares. But as Marcus scrolled through the reactions, his satisfaction began curdling into something else. "This is disgusting," read one comment. "I'm an agnostic and I think this guy is a total asshole." "Someone needs to report this vandalism to campus security," read another. "Imagine being so insecure in your beliefs that you have to kick a statue to feel better about yourself." Even some atheist commenters were criticizing his approach. "Dude, we're trying to show that atheists can be moral without religion. This makes us all look like jerks." But it was the comment from James Mitchell that hit hardest. "My mom died this morning at 6:47 a.m. I hope you're proud of yourself, Marcus. I hope proving your point was worth it." Marcus stared at his phone screen, reading James's comment over and over. The boy's mother had actually died, the morning after their argument about prayer and faith. The timing felt like a cosmic slap in the face, though Marcus immediately caught himself thinking in such unscientific terms. Correlation isn't causation, he reminded himself. James's mother's death had nothing to do with their argument or his video. Cancer killed people regardless of their religious beliefs or lack thereof. It was just an unfortunate coincidence. But somehow, the rational explanation didn't make Marcus feel any better. He spent the rest of the day in his room, ostensibly working on a paper about Nietzsche's concept of eternal recurrence, but actually obsessing over the reactions to his video. The more he read, the more he began to question whether his grand gesture had been as philosophically pure as he'd believed. Had he kicked the statue to make a rational point about the non-existence of God? Or had he done it because he was drunk, angry, and looking for a way to hurt people whose beliefs he found threatening? The question bothered him more than he wanted to admit. As evening approached, Marcus found himself unable to concentrate on anything. His usual sources of intellectual comfort, his philosophy books, his atheist podcasts, his rationalist forums, felt hollow and unsatisfying. Every time he tried to read Bertrand Russell or listen to a Christopher Hitchens debate, his mind wandered back to James's comment about his mother. Around 11 p.m., Marcus made a decision that surprised even himself. He was going to walk back to the chapel and look at the statue again. Not out of guilt or remorse. He had nothing to feel guilty about. But to prove to himself that it was indeed just carved stone, that his actions had been philosophically justified, and that any lingering unease he felt was just psychological residue from his religious upbringing. The campus was quieter on Saturday night than it had been on Friday. Most students were either studying or had gone into New York City for weekend entertainment. Marcus's footsteps echoed hollowly on the stone pathways as he made his way toward the chapel. As he approached the religious statues, Marcus was surprised to see that someone had been there before him. Fresh flowers had been placed around the Virgin Mary statue, along with several votive candles that flickered in the autumn breeze. A small handwritten sign had been posted nearby: "We pray for healing, for those who hurt others and for those who have been hurt." The sight of the memorial stopped Marcus in his tracks. He'd expected his video to generate debate about religious belief, but he hadn't anticipated this kind of response. Someone, probably multiple people, had come here not to condemn him but to pray for him. As he stood looking at the flowers and candles, Marcus felt something shifting inside his chest, not dramatically, but subtly, like the first movement of an earthquake before the major tremors begin. "It's just psychology," he murmured to himself. "Social conditioning and guilt manipulation." But even as he said it, Marcus found himself stepping closer to the statue, studying the carved face in the candlelight. There was something about the expression, the combination of sorrow and compassion, strength and gentleness, that seemed almost alive. "You're not real," he whispered to the statue, though he felt foolish for talking to carved marble. "You're just a symbol created by humans to represent their psychological need for a cosmic mother figure." The statue, naturally, didn't respond. But as Marcus stood there in the flickering candlelight, surrounded by flowers left by people who were praying for his well-being despite his attack on something they held sacred, he felt the first crack in the intellectual armor he'd been building for 3 years. Maybe, just maybe, there was something about human experience that couldn't be explained purely through materialist philosophy. The thought terrified him more than he cared to admit. Marcus stood in the flickering candlelight for nearly an hour, his mind racing through philosophical arguments and counterarguments like a computer stuck in an infinite loop. Every rational explanation he could muster for the strange feelings stirring in his chest was immediately challenged by the simple fact that he was standing in front of a statue at midnight, talking to carved stone as if it might actually respond. "This is ridiculous," he finally said aloud, his voice carrying across the empty campus quad. "I'm letting social pressure and guilt manipulation affect my judgment." But even as he said it, Marcus couldn't bring himself to leave. Something about this moment felt significant in a way that transcended rational analysis, which was exactly the kind of thinking he'd spent 3 years training himself to reject. He pulled out his phone, intending to record another video that would clarify his position and demonstrate that his resolve hadn't wavered. But when he opened the camera app, his finger hesitated over the record button. What would he say? That kicking the statue had been justified because God hadn't struck him down? That the flowers and candles were just evidence of religious delusion? That James Mitchell's mother's death was a coincidence that had nothing to do with their argument about faith? All of those things were true, Marcus told himself. But somehow, standing here surrounded by evidence of human compassion and hope, they felt inadequate. Instead of recording a video, Marcus found himself scrolling through the comments on his original post again. But this time, instead of focusing on the criticism, he found himself reading the responses differently. "I'll pray for you," wrote someone named Maria Santos. "You must be in tremendous pain to lash out like this." "Lost my faith in college too," posted another user. "Took me years to realize I wasn't rejecting God. I was rejecting the small version of God I'd been taught as a child." "My daughter was an atheist until she wasn't," commented someone called Grandma Rose 47. "Sometimes the heart knows things the mind hasn't figured out yet." Marcus had dismissed these comments earlier as typical religious platitudes, but now they felt like glimpses into human experiences he'd never seriously considered. What if faith wasn't just intellectual weakness disguised as virtue? What if there were ways of knowing and experiencing reality that couldn't be reduced to empirical observation and logical argument? The thought was so heretical to everything Marcus had built his identity around that it made him physically uncomfortable. He'd spent 3 years at Princeton learning to think clearly, to question assumptions, to demand evidence for claims. Was he really going to abandon all of that because some strangers on the internet had left flowers around a statue? "Get it together, Thompson," he muttered to himself. "You're having an emotional reaction to social pressure. This is exactly how religious manipulation works." But as he prepared to leave, Marcus noticed something that stopped him cold. Tucked among the flowers was a small piece of paper with handwriting that looked familiar. He leaned closer to read it in the candlelight. "For Marcus Thompson, may you find the peace you're looking for. James Mitchell." Marcus stared at the note in disbelief. James had been here. James, whose mother had died that morning. James, who had every reason to hate Marcus after their confrontation and the video. James had come to this statue and left flowers for the person who had publicly mocked his faith during his darkest hour. The simple act of forgiveness hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd been prepared for anger, condemnation, even retaliation. He hadn't been prepared for grace. "Why would you do this?" Marcus whispered, though James was nowhere to be seen. "I was cruel to you. I mocked everything you believe in. Your mother died, and instead of hating me, you're praying for me." For the first time in 3 years, Marcus felt the limitations of his philosophical framework. His atheistic worldview could explain James's behavior in evolutionary terms. Perhaps forgiveness was an adaptive social strategy, or maybe James was displaying learned religious behavior patterns. But those explanations felt hollow and inadequate in the face of such unexpected compassion. Marcus sank to his knees in front of the statue, not in worship but in exhaustion. The intellectual certainties that had sustained him through 3 years of college suddenly felt as fragile as glass. "I don't understand," he said to the carved figure, feeling ridiculous but unable to stop himself. "I don't understand how people can forgive like that. I don't understand how they can hope for things they can't prove. I don't understand how they can look at suffering and death and still believe in love." The statue remained silent, but something in its carved expression seemed to invite him to continue. "I've been so sure," Marcus continued, his voice cracking with emotion he hadn't expected. "So certain that I had it all figured out. That faith was weakness and doubt was strength. That anyone who believed in God was just too scared to face reality." He thought about his parents back in Atlanta, who had cried when he'd told them he was an atheist. He thought about his grandmother, who still sent him cards saying she was praying for him. He thought about all the believers he dismissed as intellectually inferior or emotionally immature. "What if I'm the one who's been scared?" he whispered. "What if I've been so afraid of being wrong that I stopped being open to anything I couldn't control or understand?" The question hung in the autumn air like a challenge. Marcus had built his identity around being the smart one, the rational one, the one brave enough to face hard truths. But sitting here in the candlelight, surrounded by flowers left by people who had responded to his cruelty with kindness, he began to wonder if true courage might actually require the willingness to admit the limits of his own understanding. "I kicked you," he said to the statue, his voice barely audible. "I mocked you, recorded it, and posted it online for everyone to see. I hurt people who loved you. And they responded by praying for me." Marcus felt tears forming in his eyes, the first tears he'd shed since his grandfather's funeral 5 years earlier. "I don't know if you're real," he continued. I don't know if God exists or if any of this means anything. But I know that what James did today, forgiving me when he had every right to hate me, that was something beyond what my philosophy can explain. As if summoned by his words, Marcus heard footsteps approaching across the quad. He quickly wiped his eyes and turned to see a figure walking toward the chapel, an elderly woman in a simple gray dress, carrying a small bag. "Oh," she said, noticing Marcus kneeling among the flowers. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize anyone was here. I'm Sister Catherine. I help take care of the chapel. I just came to replace the candles." Marcus recognized the name. Sister Catherine was something of a legend on campus, a Catholic nun who had been at Princeton for over 30 years, serving as an unofficial counselor and maternal figure for students of all faiths and no faith. She was known for her kindness, her intelligence, and her complete lack of judgment toward anyone seeking guidance. "I should go," Marcus said, starting to stand. "I don't want to interrupt." "Nonsense," Sister Catherine said gently. "This is a place for anyone who needs it." "Are you the young man who made the video?" Marcus tensed, expecting judgment or at least disappointment. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Marcus Thompson." Sister Catherine nodded thoughtfully. "I thought you might be. You have the look of someone wrestling with big questions." "I'm sorry about the statue," Marcus said quickly. "I was drunk and angry, and I did something stupid. I'll pay for any damage." "The statue is fine," Sister Catherine said, kneeling beside him to arrange fresh candles. "Marble is tougher than it looks. But I'm more concerned about you. You seem troubled." Marcus laughed bitterly. "Troubled is one way to put it. I spent 3 years convincing myself that faith was intellectual cowardice, and now I'm sitting here talking to a statue like it might actually be listening." "And what do you think? Is it listening?" The question was asked so simply, without judgment or agenda, that Marcus found himself considering it seriously. "I don't know," he admitted. 24 hours ago, I would have said absolutely not. Tonight, I honestly don't know what I think anymore." Sister Catherine smiled. "That's the beginning of wisdom, admitting what we don't know. I found that God often speaks most clearly to people who have stopped being certain about everything. But I've spent 3 years learning to think critically, to demand evidence, to reject claims that can't be proven. How do I reconcile that with faith? Who says you have to reject critical thinking to have faith?" Sister Catherine asked. Some of the greatest minds in history, Augustine, Aquinas, Teilhard de Chardin, were both deeply faithful and rigorously intellectual. Faith isn't the absence of questions, it's the courage to live with questions that don't have easy answers. Marcus considered this. He'd always assumed that faith and reason were mutually exclusive, that belief required the suspension of critical faculties. But Sister Catherine was clearly an intelligent woman. He'd heard she had a PhD in philosophy from Harvard, and she didn't seem to see any contradiction between faith and intellectual rigor. "I hurt people today," Marcus said suddenly. "James Mitchell's mother died this morning, and yesterday I mocked his faith. I called it a psychological crutch for weak people. And instead of hating me, he came here and left flowers and a note saying he was praying for me." "That must have been confusing," Sister Catherine said gently. "It was impossible," Marcus said. "According to everything I believe about human nature and evolutionary psychology, he should want to hurt me back. Forgiveness like that doesn't make sense from a purely materialist perspective. Unless there's more to human nature than materialism can explain," Sister Catherine suggested. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, watching the candle flames dance in the autumn breeze. "What if I've been wrong?" he asked finally. What if God is real and I've spent 3 years mocking him? What if faith isn't weakness but strength? What if I've been the one who's been too scared to consider possibilities beyond what I can prove? What if you have been wrong? Sister Catherine asked. What would that mean for you? Marcus thought about the question seriously. It would mean I've been incredibly arrogant. It would mean I've hurt people for no good reason. It would mean I need to completely rethink everything I thought I knew about reality. And does that possibility terrify you? Yes, Marcus admitted. It terrifies me more than anything I've ever faced. Sister Catherine nodded, understanding. Faith is terrifying, Marcus. It requires admitting that we're not in control, that there are mysteries beyond our comprehension, that love might be more fundamental to reality than logic. It's much scarier than atheism in many ways. So how do people do it? How do they make that leap? Most don't make a leap, Sister Catherine said. They take small steps. They start by admitting what they don't know. They pay attention to experiences that don't fit their existing worldview. They consider the possibility that truth might be bigger than their ability to understand it. Marcus looked at the statue again, really looking at the carved face in the candlelight. I kicked this statue yesterday because I was angry at God for not existing. Tonight, I'm sitting here talking to a nun about the possibility that he does exist. I don't know what's happening to me. Maybe you're growing, Sister Catherine suggested. Maybe your soul is outgrowing the small box you built to contain it. I don't even know if I believe in souls. That's okay. Belief isn't a prerequisite for having one. They sat together in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the candles flicker and listening to the distant sounds of campus life. Sister Catherine, Marcus said finally, if I wanted to explore faith, hypothetically, where would I start? I don't know how to believe in something I can't prove. Start with what you do know, she said. You know that love exists, even if you can't measure it in a laboratory. You know that beauty exists, even if you can't reduce it to chemical reactions. You know that forgiveness exists, because James showed it to you today. Start there, and see where those experiences lead you. And if I'm still full of doubts and questions? Then you'll fit right in, Sister Catherine said with a smile. The best believers I know are the ones who never stop questioning, never stop growing, never stop marveling at how much they don't understand. Certainty is overrated, Marcus. Wonder is much more interesting. As Sister Catherine prepared to leave, she placed a gentle hand on Marcus's shoulder. The chapel is always open, she said. And so is the invitation to keep exploring these questions. God isn't afraid of your doubts, Marcus. He's more interested in your honesty than your certainty. After she left, Marcus remained kneeling among the flowers and candles for another hour. He thought about James's unexpected forgiveness, about Sister Catherine's gentle wisdom, about the possibility that reality might be larger and more mysterious than his philosophy had allowed. Finally, he pulled out his phone and began typing a new post. 24 hours ago, I kicked a statue of the Virgin Mary and posted a video mocking religious faith. I was wrong, not just about the disrespect, but about faith itself. I don't know if God exists, but I know that the believers who responded to my cruelty with kindness showed me something my atheism couldn't explain. I'm taking down the original video and publicly apologizing to everyone I hurt. I have a lot to learn about humility, forgiveness, and the possibility that truth might be bigger than what I can prove. Marcus Thompson. He posted the message across all his social media accounts, then put his phone away and looked at the statue one more time. I don't know if you're there, he said quietly. But if you are, Thank you for being patient with me. Thank you for sending people who showed me what love looks like when it's not earning anything in return." Marcus stood up slowly, his knees stiff from kneeling on the stone path. As he prepared to leave, he noticed something he hadn't seen before, a small plaque at the base of the statue that read, "Our Lady of Mercy, Mother of all who seek." "Mother of all who seek," Marcus repeated softly. For the first time in 3 years, Marcus Thompson was genuinely seeking something beyond his own understanding. And somehow, that felt like the beginning of wisdom rather than the end of reason. As he walked back across campus toward his dormitory, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood, the excitement of not knowing what came next, of being open to possibilities he couldn't control or predict. Behind him, the candles continued to flicker around the Virgin Mary statue, and somewhere in the autumn darkness, the sound of chapel bells began to ring midnight, marking exactly 24 hours since Marcus had issued his challenge to God. He never did get his lightning bolt or miraculous vision. But he got something better. The beginning of a heart humble enough to consider that love might be more fundamental to reality than logic, and that the greatest truths might require not proof, but faith. 3 months later, Marcus Thompson would be baptized in the Princeton University Chapel, with James Mitchell standing beside him as his sponsor. But that's another story, one that began with a kick, continued with forgiveness, and bloomed into the kind of faith that transforms doubt into wonder and pride into love. And there you have it. This incredible story of intellectual pride meeting divine mercy touched your heart, didn't it? Marcus proved that even the most militant atheist can't kick their way out of God's love. And sometimes our greatest opposition to faith is actually our deepest cry for truth, right? If you were moved by this real testimony of how a Princeton atheist kicked a Virgin Mary statue in rage and found himself sobbing in the same chapel 24 hours later, begging forgiveness from a God he claimed didn't exist, hit that like button below. It really helps me continue sharing these stories that show how the Virgin Mary reaches even the most hardened hearts. If you're not subscribed yet, subscribe now and hit that notification bell. Every week there's a new testimony that will renew your faith that God's love is bigger than our doubts, and that Mary never gives up on bringing souls to her Son Jesus. And don't forget to check out our store in the first pinned comment. We have amazing Christian products, including the 365-day devotional, perfect for strengthening your relationship with Jesus and understanding how faith and reason work together. Tell us in the comments, have you ever gone through a crisis of faith or questioned God's existence? Do you believe the Virgin Mary can reach even militant atheists? And if you also believe in God's power to transform intellectual pride into humble faith, write, "Truth is bigger than proof." Declare your faith in mysteries beyond human understanding. Share this video with college students, with anyone struggling with faith and reason, with intellectuals who think belief is weakness, with everyone who needs to know that God welcomes our questions and transforms our doubts into deeper faith. Thanks for watching until the end. May the Virgin Mary bless your intellectual journey and help you discover that the greatest truths require not just evidence, but an open heart. See you in the next testimony.